He is the voice of the Boston Celtics radio network. We welcome Sean Grande onto Hoopsology. How's it going, Sean?
It's going. It's going.
Appreciate you coming on to the show. And a lot of our first-time guests, we like to ask what sparked their passion for basketball. So I want to ask you, you can kind of take this question any way you want it, either your first basketball memory or your favorite basketball memory.
Well, it's funny. I had a passion for everything. I was lucky enough to grow up in New York, and so you get everything. Everything is just, you have your baseball and you have your football, and I was just a sports kid obsessed with everything. The basketball thing is interesting because the Knicks were not very good when I was a kid. It was not, and the NBA was not. When I was a very young kid, was really the down cycle of the NBA. It was easy to go to Madison Square Garden whenever you wanted to. I was probably more of a Ranger fan than I was a Knicks fan. It was hard to be a fan of both the NHL and the NBA because you kind of have to pick and choose.
Yeah.
But basketball is interesting because I grew up in Greenwich Village on Bleecker Street, and my dad sometimes would walk me down to, I lived 2 or 3 blocks away from the 4th Street Cage, 4th Street and 6th Avenue, which is not the Rucker, but it's probably like the number 2 spot in Manhattan. You'd see like Nancy Lieberman, and you'd see, the great city players playing there. And my dad had a great appreciation for it. And, I think it sort of started there. Play-by-play is a funny thing because you don't get to pick and choose often. Whenever I speak to groups of kids who want to be sportscasters when they grow up, if I'm doing it in Boston, I'll say, how many of you want to be the voice of the Boston Red Sox? And, 80 hands go up. I'm like, well, there's 3 jobs. There's 2 radio spots and a TV spot. So, you may want to be the voice of the Boston Red Sox. You may end up being the voice of the Calgary Flames.
Yeah.
That's how this works. And, from a trajectory standpoint, it always seems, if you go, now I'm jogging my memory because when you get old, as my son often reminds me of how old I am, you have to say, well, what was going on? Like back in the 90s, my trajectory was towards hockey. There wasn't a lot of baseball to do at that time, but I always assumed I would be the voice of the Mets or the voice of the Rangers, when I grew up. And when I was sort of ready, after a lot of years of college sports here and doing hockey and all the other stuff, the jobs that were open that year in 1998 when I was 26 or whatever it was, the Nashville Predators were a new team in the NHL, an expansion team. And the other job that was open was the Minnesota Timberwolves TV job. And that's the one I got. And 25 years later, almost, next year, a year and a half from now, it'll be 25 years.
Wow.
Since I went, tell me about it. When I went in the league, that all of a sudden you realize like the sport that was probably captured your attention the least or had the least amount of your time that you could spend, because my parents kept annoying me about going to school every day. Like that filled up so much time that I could have been spent on sports, but instead.
Me too.
But here it is, almost a quarter of a century later, and I know that I'm living the first line of my obituary now. As you said, Sean Grande is going to be remembered more likely than not as the voice of the Boston Celtics, no matter how many hockey games I do or baseball games I do or football games I do or MMA fights or boxing or anything I call. Chances are that's going to be the first line.
Can you kind of explain just the evolution of the game since you first got your first TV position to now in terms of players, just the product on the court, what you personally felt when you first called your first NBA game to what you're seeing now, just negatively, positively, just like kind of the evolution that you've seen the game from your perspective. I think you bring a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge in terms of what you've kind of seen during that time span compared to just kind of the average fan that's sitting on their couch every day.
That's a nice way of saying old, right? You're old. So what was it like when you were young versus now when you're old? Again, I got a big birthday coming up with a 0 coming up at the end, so everyone's kind of giving me a lot of grief. I think it's funny because I came in with Minnesota, and that was a team, I don't have it in front of me, but I'd be willing to guess, took 8 to 12 threes a game, maybe, at that time. I remember a game, one of the famous games I did as far as like probably my most famous moment in Minnesota was the Martin Luther King game at Target Center when Malik Sealy hit a 3, capped the comeback. Timberwolves beat the Pacers. And my call that night was 3 at last, because the Wolves hadn't made one. Try to imagine that in today's game. They had not made a 3. Last night, as we're talking now, the Celtics were in Atlanta last night, and Trae Young didn't make a 3. And that was a big story, that one guy, oh my gosh, this one guy didn't make a 3. Back then, it was a little unusual. Like, oh my gosh, the Timberwolves haven't made a 3, and then they finally make one to win the game. But that was, and the Wolves were sort of late to the party as a franchise shooting the three. But go back for the fun of it, depending on how you define fun. Go back and look at the NBA box scores from the early 80s. The three-point shot is in. Go back and look at the first 5 or 6 years and how few were taken and how people weren't very good at it when they did take it. And versus now, and talking about Trae Young, it's interesting because about 5 years ago, maybe even more, in one of my pregame conversations with Brad Stevens, I asked him, with the proliferation of the three-point shot and the attempts going up and up, and this isn't now where it's like 35, 40 a game. This is 5 years ago when it's really starting to go up. And I said, do you think most sports are cyclical? There's the 3-4 defense, and then there's a 4-3, and then there's a zone blitz and whatever. But eventually it all circles back, and everyone keeps adjusting and just go around in circles. Will the NBA eventually go back to being a game in the post and, the way it was? And he said, as opposed to everything being at the three-point line, and he said, and it was a prescient comment at the time, 5-6 years ago, he said, no, I think it's going to go the other way. And I'm like, what do you mean the other way? He goes, be like where it is now. It's just that the three-point line is just a suggestion. And we're talking about guys coming into the league that you have to pick up at half court because they will not only take that shot, they will make it. And it's changed defenses. And even now, as we talk in November of 2021, we're going through a significant revolution with the rules. Now the game is called and an adjustment that's made the game better and not rewarded guys by as many free throws. But it's a constant evolution. But it certainly has changed quite a bit. And I'd say the three-point shot is the first thing that you think of, and that not just the distance of them, but that virtually everybody can take one. And tomorrow night, as we're talking, Rajon Rondo comes back to Boston. And here's a guy who at one point in this golden age of the point guard, he became the guy 10, 12 years ago. And very quickly, the game evolved to the point where it was difficult to have a guy who can't shoot on the floor. Celtics are dealing with that right now this year.
So you mentioned the rules changes, and I think speaking as a fan, it's been a very positive outcome in terms of just watching the league, every night. A lot's been made about some players struggling. Do you think this is going to be an instance of, I guess, that issue being overblown, for instance, with James Harden, and then you mentioned Trae Young, and I think they're highly skilled. I think they'll eventually figure it out. Do you think that's been blown out of proportion in the mainstream media in terms of them struggling with the rules change, or do you think this is going to be a prolific issue that could kind of, be a factor, later on in their career?
Well, it's funny because nine times out of 10, 95 out of 100, things almost by definition are blown out of proportion. That's what happens when there's 1,000 podcasts and a million shows that have to be filled. But this is actually something that is significant. Now, Harden, I don't worry about, because if you tell James Harden the new rules in basketball are you have to play with your hands tied behind your back, he will become the best guy at dribbling with his teeth that there is, because he will just adapt and evolve to whatever the game is. He will figure it out. I have no concerns about James Harden. What's really interesting, for a guy like Trae Young, and I was talking about this with Ime Udoka last night, that I think Trae Young is going to become a better shooter now, because you've taken that ridiculous stop in traffic to try to let the car behind you hit you, jump into somebody. It's actually going to make him a better shooter, because it's going to take that nonsense out of the arsenal, and now you just got to make the shot. And I think it's going to, okay, so the guy who gets to the free throw line 9 times a game will get there 6 times a game. So he'll score 2 or 3 fewer points a game, and maybe that'll be tough for him, and we'll all lose sleep over that. Meanwhile, we'll get a much better game. And by the way, scores were artificially high because there were too many free throws. That's not how you want scores to be high. You want scores to be high because there's flow to the game, and what they've done this year is improve the flow.
And is it just me, or I just sense like the games are a lot more competitive too? Like usually in the regular season, it's kind of like calm me until Christmas break happens in terms of really, taking the NBA seriously in terms of how the teams are working out. But now to see there's a lot of more competitive balance. Like this really, you can't really take a night off anymore, just early in the season. Am I wrong perceiving that? Or do you think it's still really early and it's kind of like things are still working itself out? We're just kind of early into the season.
It's still early in the season to figure it out. But I think that's fair in that we're all, first of all, teams trying to get back to normal. We're playing in front of fans again. I think that adds an element to it that we, was sorely missing for a year and a half. But in both conferences, specifically in the East, this is, in the 24 years I've been in, easily the deepest the Eastern Conference has ever been. And the point that these games early in the season, the biggest misconception about the NBA is that the game is decided in the final 2 minutes. The biggest misconception about long seasons is that the games don't really matter until after Christmas or down the stretch. Really? Because it seems like, doing the math, that the game on October 25th counts the exact same as the game on March 25th. And if you get behind the 8 ball, particularly in the Eastern Conference here, or in the West with the Lakers, for example, who are 500 despite 12 of their first 16 being at home, you've got a problem because there's so much, there's competition now. In the Eastern Conference, there's Orlando, and they just won this week at New York. So there's Orlando, you figure will be at the bottom. Detroit, is going to be at the bottom. Depending on how you feel about Cleveland, I love their young talent. I'm not sure that it's sustainable, that they can stay up in the top 6, for most of the year. I think they'll probably end up towards the bottom. But how many easy nights? Is that still an easy night now, going into Cleveland with Mo? Because Mobley's going to be here a long time, by the way.
Sure.
That kid is ready to play.
Sure
There's
is.
an Al Horford element where when Al Horford came in the league, the Hawks weren't necessarily that good. They didn't make the playoffs, and I was scared the heck out of the Celtics that first year. But you guys come in, and they don't blink at the lights. Scotty Barnes in Toronto, guys are coming in like, okay, yeah, I'm not. If you scared, get a dog. I'm not worried. This is the NBA, and I belong here. So there are very few easy nights, is the point, in the East and the West, which is not always the case. And now, even with the play-in, just to get to the top 6 to avoid the play-in, what are you going to have to win in the East? The last time, by the way, I know this for a fact. I looked it up because I thought it was going to happen, and maybe this is the year it happens. The last team to win 50 games in the East and not get home court in the first round was the Hawks in '99. You got to go back to the last millennium, the last time a 50-win team didn't get home court. I can see that happening this year because there's so many teams that are going to be in that 48 to 51 range. But that's, I think, going to make these games more competitive. And also, the other element is more and more stars out. Guys are going. There's COVID. There's injuries. More and more guys out, and that's more guys. Those games sometimes become more competitive because the understudies play super hard because it's their chance to play.
So what do you make of the Boston Celtics and how they fit in this new Eastern Conference that's so competitive? As we're recording on this podcast, they're 7-8, and it seems like they're starting to try to find their footing. What do you make of kind of Tatum and Brown? I know Tatum had a hard season this past season. It really, we had a good game against the Hawks despite losing. Where do you kind of make it this Boston Celtics team in terms of how they fit, and what are your kind of biggest concerns in terms of kind of red flags that you see now that could pop up when we head towards the playoffs?
Well, it's funny. The Celtics and Lakers have the big national game as we're talking tomorrow night. And in a league in which we just talked about that is completely predicated on three-point shooting and on shooting, I'm not sure the Celtics or Lakers have enough shooting to be competitive and to make the runs that the most optimistic people think they're going to make. The Tatum thing was interesting because it's getting pretty close to this being like a Space Jam thing with Tatum because he all of a sudden just not looking like himself at all at the start of the year. How much of that is because as we've watched Tatum evolve, there's always been Al Horford, Kyrie Irving, Gordon Hayward, Jaylen Brown, all these guys around him. And now there's just Jaylen, and Jaylen's missed the last few games. And all of a sudden it's Tatum is your number one offensive option by a mile. And obviously that's the first thing that teams want to stop. So that's a factor. I think that people in Boston always find a way to ratchet expectations up out of control. They just talk themselves into it. The Celtics last year finished 7th in the Eastern Conference. And on paper, they're sort of starting anew, new coach, new team president, new roster. Granted, they're older, which is certainly a plus when you're adding Schroeder and Josh Richardson or whatever. You're older and Al coming back. That's a good thing in terms of experience. But why would you anticipate with other teams getting better, with Washington getting better and Chicago getting better, why on paper would you necessarily think the Celtics have improved their standing in the Eastern Conference? You can say, well, they'll be healthy this year. They lost the most games because of COVID last year. Tatum and Brown will be a year better. Of course, all those things could happen. But I think you have to start. People here just start assuming for some reason that they're going to be this elite team starting out. They were dead 500, 7th place Eastern Conference team last year. So what does better look like? They have to be, to stay 7th, they're going to have to be better because the East is better than it was. So I think to me, they look like, when you look at the Celtics roster, there's a lot of plus defensive players on this team. And I think it's starting to now take form over the last few weeks of what we thought this team could be, which is it's somewhere between good and elite defensively And offensively, are they going to be middle of the pack? Because that's going to be good enough to win a lot of games. Or are they going to really have trouble some night scoring? And we've seen a lot of that. And a team that's shooting 32% from three in today's NBA is, as hard as they play defensively and as well as they play defensively, it's going to be tough to win games unless they get some more offense in there. And remember them playing without Jaylen Brown and Rob Williams last week. So you get those two guys back, and the offense should be better.
You mentioned the fans, and I want to ask you, when you deal with that kind of harsh truth to them, even though that might be reality, what is kind of their response in terms of dealing with that passionate fan base? I mean, is it sometimes frustrating for you just to be like, hey, these are the facts, this is the truth, and yet they just have these grand designs of like their team just automatically being in the NBA Finals? Is that kind of difficult when you're just trying to lay out kind of the facts and the true projections of this team when you're dealing with the fan base that are just, they want to hear like not the truth, but just kind of like a fantasy of what they could be?
It's a really good question, and it can be. And Cedric Maxwell and I, from time to time over the years, have been the guys who will make fans eat their vegetables once in a while, even if they don't want to. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, particularly because, and again, this is entertainment. So on the television side, particularly with the late, great Tommy Heinsohn, who I was so fortunate to spend decades with and learning from, but Tommy did his shtick, and Mike and Tommy on TV were doing a Homer telecast, and they were presenting it a certain way. So it was almost on us. Part of our obligation when we first started together in 2001 was to sort of create something different anyway. And from time to time, the crazy super fanatic, I mean, it's different when you've been here for 20 years. They know us and they know what we do. But there are times that there are the very vocal minority that get annoyed when we dare say that LeBron is one of the greatest players ever to play, when you call it like it is. And I have a national network flair to what I do, which is calling it, this is the reality. This is what's actually happening now. But the secondary part of that has to do with what's happened in Boston and over the last 20 years. I come back here from Minnesota in 2001. And in my first year here with Max, the Celtics go to the conference finals out of nowhere. They'd missed the playoffs for 6 years in a row. Hadn't been in the playoffs in 7 years, and don't just make the playoffs. They go to Game 6 of the conference finals. There's the Paul Pierce, Antoine Walker comeback. They're up 2-1. They've got home court in the conference finals to go to the NBA finals here. And when they lost, the city wanted to have a parade for that team because they went to the conference finals. In fact, things were so bleak in Boston, there had been a parade the year before for a player who had won a championship in another city, the city you're sitting in right now, when Ray Bork won the Stanley Cup. They had a parade for him here because the feeling, well, this might be as close as we ever get, right? They had a parade for him. So that was the mindset here. Now flash forward 20 years. You've got 6 Super Bowls. You've got 4 World Series. You've got Celtics championship, the Bruins Stanley Cup. Bruins and Celtics have been to the finals several other times. Celtics and the Patriots in 3 other Super Bowls. So suddenly, flash back to a year and a half ago in the bubble, the Celtics lose Kyrie, they lose Horford, they lose Morris, they lose Rozier, and they go to the conference finals anyway. It's one of the most underappreciated Celtics teams in history. 3rd best team in the NBA. 2nd best team, maybe the 3rd best Celtics team in the last 30 years after 08 and 09 where Garnett got hurt. And people were, not, again, vocal minority. People were almost spitting on it. Conference finals, in part because they lost to Miami, not to Milwaukee. Conference finals, we're about championships here. Okay, but there's 30 teams. And that was, I use that now, again, being old. That's a 20-year snapshot difference in going to Game 6 of the conference finals and the reaction to it and the expectations. And that's what happens when you overperform. And for under Brad Stevens, for the first 5-6 years, every single year they went farther than they should have. And out of nowhere, starting again from scratch after the Pierce Garnett trade to Brooklyn, you started from scratch. And for 5 years, from the middle of Brad's second year, so early last season, really for 6 years, like early 2015 to early 2021, the Celtics were a top 5 team in the NBA. But people here just want more, expect more, and they don't want to hear it when you say, why don't you ask people in Sacramento? Why don't you ask people in Minnesota? Why don't you ask people how they would feel about going to the conference finals?
Yeah, Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And to that point, I want to ask you: do you think Tatum and Brown? Do they feel disrespected because of that kind of environment? And because they've had tons of success. I mean, this
Yeah.
is not a team that's, I think, like you said, underperformed. They've been pretty phenomenal in recent times. But yeah, I just feel like both, like you said, from a local standpoint and nationally, they're just getting mudslug at them. Just kind of. Um,
No, and the answer is no, because they have Tatum and Brown. Those guys are young men who have great
sure,
expectations of themselves, and they
sure.
expect to play for championships, and they want it, and whatever. This is the
Yeah.
sort of the telltale year for them now, because the great dilemma in Boston is you have two stars, so a third star should do it. The question is, which is unanswered. There's no definitive answer yet, but we have to get an answer to the question: do Tatum and Brown replicate each other too much, or can those two plus a third star win, or do you need to change one of those two because they're too similar?
I want to ask you, Sean, about Marcus Smart's comments. And I heard you on a podcast, and I thought you were very insightful in terms of Marcus Smart just being honest and just, it was his question was asked in context. And I just want to ask you from a sports media perspective, we're seeing a lot of long form podcasts. We're seeing, the players having more of a voice. Do you see, it may almost be overly optimistic, do you see a day that, the hot takes and just like the daily just banter between two just talking heads kind of going away, and instead of sports fans engaging in more in thoughtful conversation in context to the Marcus Smart situation, that if we do encounter that in years, following, that it won't be a big deal, that people will understand context and that people won't blow that out of proportion as it was when that actually happened?
No, it won't go away because nothing's going to go away. We're just going to get where we had 6 channels when I grew up, and then it became 30 channels with cable. Now there's 1,000 channels, and eventually there'll be 2,000 channels. So the hot takes aren't going to go away. You're just going to have more different ways to take them all in, and different ways. If you want to get page clicks on this, Grande questions whether Jaylen Brown and Tatum fit together, right? Because I brought up the question. So you can take whatever you want and make it whatever you want. I'm not. Sometimes people interpret when I reference the talk shows or whatever that I'm being negative about it. I came up through that environment and working on those shows, and I understand how they work, and I have no qualms whatsoever. I wish people understood that it's show business, and that sometimes it's difficult. If you're in my job, I believe you have to be what I call bilingual. Okay, you have to be able to speak that language too, and you have to know that the audience you have, you're calling the game and you're telling the story of what's actually happening, and you're behind the scenes and you're traveling, so you understand. But also, you have to know that you've just been subjected. You potentially have people listening have just been subjected to 10 hours of hot take theater. So, and that's what pays the bills, and it's great, and it's entertainment. It's more people talking about the team, but you have to be able to speak that language and understand what people are talking about. On the other hand, to know Marcus shouldn't have said what he said, not because he wasn't being honest or he wasn't right. Listen to what he actually said, which is that it's going to be what Marcus Smart said was that those guys are going to be better players. It's going to be easier for them when they get better moving the ball. That's exactly right. It was a reasoned take, and he was answering a question. On the one hand, is it Marcus's job or is it not to know that what the talk shows and hot take theater are going to do with that head? Marcus Smart says they need to pass more. And because that becomes its own thing where people say, man, you'll get texts from people. Marcus said they need to pass more. I'm like, you didn't listen to what he said.
Right.
And stop me if this sounds familiar to what we've all been living through for the last year and a half regarding our country, regarding the issues, regarding science or vaccination. It's like Marcus did. Yeah, I know what Marcus said. I did my own research. Okay. You didn't, and you don't know what research is. Like, did you publish a paper on Mark and a dissertation of Marcus Smart's comments and what he was asked and what he actually said? Did you publish it? Have you done multiple research projects of how the vaccine has affected hospital? No, you didn't. You didn't do your own research. You got to post on your personal Facebook page, and now that's fine. But at some point, being the voice, nobody necessarily wants to hear the voice of reason. But if I'm asked about the Marcus Smart thing, I'm going to answer honestly, which is this is the thing. That said, but I probably would have said if I'm in PR, as Marcus, don't say it because it's not worth it. It's not worth the trouble that comes with it.
Sean, one last question before I let you go, and because I'm just a media nerd and I love just the behind the scenes of broadcasting, and you kind of went into detail again on a previous podcast about commentating in terms of being in the arena compared to doing it remotely. And I just want to ask, this might be a stupid question, but I'm just wondering, these are unprecedented times, and I never thought the NBA would just be postponed or in a bubble. So I guess anything is possible. I just want to ask you, is there any way that the league can kind of prepare for a scenario that we saw in 2020 and 2021 in terms from a broadcasting perspective, in terms of still giving you the best resources to provide the best product to your audience while keeping your safety, in mind too? Or is this going to be, if this happens to happen again, which I think anything is possible, do you think, hey, the product is just going to suffer in terms of you might have to just do games remotely? I mean, because you mentioned just the struggles of that. So I'm just wondering, do you think if the league runs into the situation again in the future, is there any kind of a way to make sure that you have the resources to provide just the audience the best product, and for yourself to make sure that you're doing the best job possible?
Well, evolve or die. That comes with every single thing you do. Yeah. People ask me about, and I'll get to that because it's an important question. Just a very small example of how I would prepare for games. Some people it's very easy, particularly when you get older, to do things the way you've always done it. The way I do it is the best way, and I'm not going to just the way. I used manila folders for years, and I had one for each game, and I had a system to how I did it. I started doing 6 years ago now. I took a crazy jump off a professional cliff and started doing something I had never done before, which was MMA. And I started calling fights, and I had to come up with a different way to prepare. So I bought like a big art sketchbook and kept each fight in that book. And that way I had the previous fighter. When I would have them again, I had the page from their previous fight. And I got through, did that for a couple of years. And I thought, I wonder, what? Instead of carrying all these manila folders around and picking which ones I want to take on any given trip, what if I used a single book for a season for the NBA and started taking the things that I put on the manila folders and use like a card to the other team, and like by play-by-play scores, I keep track of the game and the forms that I use and the sheets that I use for the numbers and whatever. And now, long story short, I'm 4 or 5 years into using books, so I have a book for each season. It was just a change. You keep your mind open. Doing games remotely is a disaster in pretty much every way there is, because you cannot cover a team if you're not with the team. That said, Max and I did the best we could over the last couple of years. It was different with access. Like I could text Brad Stevens whenever I want. I could just fire off a text if I needed a question answered or something like that. But we had announcers in the league, veteran announcers, who had, say, a new coach. And in Chicago, my friend Chuck Swirsky, longtime voice of the Bulls, he hadn't met Billy Donovan. They never met.
Wow. And
he was coaching the team all last year. So you can't do the job that way. Are there bits and pieces of this? The video wall that, where you had fans reacting live at home, and later WWE incorporated that.
That's right.
During the pandemic, and did this amazing thing. It's nothing substitutes for the live crowd. But here's an example of something. So everything started to be on Zoom, obviously. And then, pre-game, all the press conferences. I know reporters like to have access to players and things like that, and hopefully some of that will come back. But coaches, for example, the coaches pre-game. Sometimes you have to run around a building to go from one to the other, and then I'm racing back to my spot to record my thing. The coaches pre-game media sessions being on Zoom is an example of something that came out of the pandemic that makes our jobs better and our jobs easier to do. There's lots of things like that. So if we just pay attention, we can take from the situation into which we were thrust and take bits and pieces, and not just say, oh my God, thank God the pandemic is over, when it finally is over, and we can just move back to our lives the way they used to be. Well, wait a minute. What did we learn? What can be better? And it's like making the game, like we started talking about how the game is better now than it was. Broadcast can always be better. I hope 50 years from now, the broadcasts that I've done in all the different sports, that they look primitive and whatever. Yeah, Grande was good, but like in his time, back in the 20s, in the early, 21st century, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it's gotten much better. Hopefully everything evolves. And, you have to keep your eyes open. The minute you close your eyes to something new, that's evolve or die.
That's true. Totally agree. Sean, Appreciate the time. Keith, please let our audience know where they can find you on social media, where they can catch your broadcast, anything else you want our audience to know as well, any projects or any of the maybe MMA fights are coming up.
This is like a talk show. Well, hey, you can check me out in the new Kevin Garnett documentary on Showtime that premiered last week, which is obviously, by the way, you should watch it. Everybody should watch the Kevin Garnett documentary.
For sure.
It's pretty awesome. But yeah, I always hesitate because I think not if you're just going to be mean on social media. I'm not going to give it out. But Sean Grande PvP is where I've always lived on Twitter, and Twitter's that's a great example, by the way, of when it first became prominent. A lot of announcers in the league were like, I'm not going to do that. I was like, you know what? There's certainly plenty of downside to it, but I use it. I've done TV for years. Switching to radio, you don't have graphics, you don't have statistics that you want to describe. So I use it that way. I build my own TV graphics that I would use if I were doing the game on TV, and I can put them on Twitter because the idea that people are sitting around the kitchen table and they just have the radio on and they're moving little Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum pieces around as I call the game. I get that that's not happening. But you just want to provide people as much information and different content as possible, whether it's a podcast like this or a tweet with a stat about how Marcus Smart had a better 3-point shooting percentage than Larry Bird his first 5 years. People go crazy when they hear that one. It's use everything you can to reach as much of the audience as you can. It's that simple.
I appreciate you coming out to the show, Sean. Thank you very much.
You got it.